in this Holy Land, there's always been a lot of violence and oppression and injustice going back to ancient times. Whether you're talking about the little Jewish kingdoms that existed here, which wasn't nearly as big and as magnificent as people like to believe, but way back then. Then on the Greek times and the Roman times, and then the Muslim invasion and so on. So then the Ottoman Empire, then the British Empire with its greed and its brutality, and then, of course, the foundation of the State of Israel, which could only have been accomplished by denying the rights of the local population. So in that sense, it's just another colonial project, what's happened here. Now, it was driven by significant trauma on the part of the Jews in Europe. I mean, that's one of the worst events, not one of the worst. In some sense, it's the worst event in history, where there was a deliberate attempt to extirpate a whole people by mechanical, scientifically designed violence. And long before then, history of Jewish suffering and antisemitism in Eastern Europe and throughout Europe. So in that sense, the project that led to the creation of the Jewish state arose out of deep trauma, unspeakable trauma. And as a matter of fact, when you read the histories of the 47 war, 47-48 war, the usual history is that the war began when the Arabs invaded. No, it didn't. The war started many months before then, when Jewish forces started taking over Arab villages and committing atrocities. And as has been demonstrated by Israeli historians, this was a planned project right from the beginning. And as a former Zionist, I can tell you, there's no way that you could create a country in a land when there's a local population that wants to hold on to their land without creating violence. There's just no way. So there's no other way it could have been done, no matter what the histories say or what the pseudo-histories say. There's no ways it could have been done. But the soldiers, the Jewish soldiers, many of them who just came from Europe, when they were fighting the local Arabs, who, to the extent they fought at all, which wasn't much, but to the extent that they fought at all, they were trying to protect their homelands. But in the eyes of the Jewish immigrants, they were just reincarnation of the Nazis. More people that want to kill us and keep us from having our life. So a lot of the soldiers did experience it that way. That's understandable to me in the context of the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, Zionism is always fed upon Jewish trauma to justify violence and control and expansion. So this slogan, never again, which could mean no humans will behave that way again to anybody else, in the chauvinist context means they're not going to do it to us ever again, and we're going to be the stronger ones that are going to do it to them before they do it to us. Well, that's a trauma response. But it also feeds into a colonial project. And a colonial project means it's the people in the land, immigrants want to take it over, mostly immigrants. In 1917, when David Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, the British foreign minister, who the hell was he to promise a foreign land to anybody else? But when he issued that declaration that the British government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish entity in Palestine, etc., there were something like 100,000 Jews here, or 75,000, and 500,000 Arabs. How are those 500,000 are supposed to feel about the 75,000 declaring, as they did, I'm quoting Zionist history, that our aim in as short a time as possible to make Palestine as Jewish, as England is English, and America is an American. And as America is American. So how are the local populations supposed to feel? They're going to resist. And that resistance, you can only beat down by brutal force. And you can only get rid of them by brutal force. And that's what happened, and that's what continues to happen. Now, in that, it's not dissimilar from any other colonial project. Same thing happened in my country, Canada, where the local population, the indigenous population, was brutally treated, forced off their lands. This whole occupied territories where we're speaking now is like a giant reservation, literally with walls around it. Well, our native people in Canada were forced onto these reservations, deprived of their livelihood, deprived of their lands, deprived of their culture. In South Africa, the same thing. You know, the Boers and the British, who eventually fought against each other, but what they were fighting was the right to be the colonialists, who would exclude, oppress, and delegitimize the local people. So in that sense, this is like any other colonial project. So it's fed by a stream of trauma, but after all these decades, we can't talk about trauma anymore. It's simply colonialism, pure and simple, and it's an apartheid state, which is what the colonialist has to do. Just as Canada was an apartheid state, the United States was an apartheid state in significant terms, that the natives had to stay in certain places, they had only limited rights, they had not the rights of the rest of the population. This is no different. So Israel in that sense is no better or worse than other colonial countries. It's only that it's the latest one, and it's the longest standing ethnic cleansing in the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. It's been going on now for, well, gosh, coming on to 100 years now, fairly soon, 90 years, 80 years. And it continues, not because it has to, but because the colonial project will not surrender itself to reality, to human reality. The result is, when anybody who travels, I mean, just today, outside the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, heavily armed army patrol bravely arrests a 15-year-old Palestinian girl because she sits in the wrong place. They arrest her. Tourists are just walking by. And this is how these children are growing up. I mean, this is... What's tragic about it is that this was foreseen. There were Jews back in the 1890s, 125 years ago now, a Jewish spiritual teacher who said that if we continue to act this way towards the Arabs, this is in the 1890s when there was only a few thousand Jews here, and they said if we continue to act this way towards the Arabs, all that we'll end up with is one small Levantine people oppressing another small Levantine people. There were Zionist leaders who back in 1905 or thereabouts said, we keep saying a people without a land for a land without a people. But there's no land without a people. There are people here, and these people are going to fight. David Ben-Gurion, who's the first prime minister of Israel and the top Zionist leader, his rival, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, which eventually became the Herut, which became the Likud, who was a good friend of my grandfather's, by the way. My grandfather who died in Auschwitz, he was a physician and a strong Zionist leader who would right now be outraged at what he's seeing right now. But both Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky said in almost similar terms that what the Arabs are doing is not terrorism. There are people fighting for their land, and if they're in position, we would do exactly the same thing. So all this propaganda about the terrorists and this and that, you know, yeah, there have been terrible acts of terror on the part of the Palestinians. That's what people do when they're driven to desperation. I'm not justifying it. Didn't help them, didn't help anything. Made things worse. But the rage, the frustration that drives it, who created it? So, I could go on, but that's what we're seeing. And what we're seeing, of course, is in its benevolent wisdom, the democratic Supreme Court of Israel last week ruled that the army has the right to move some Bedouin people off their lands in the occupied territories to make room for what? More Jewish settlements. And as a Jew, I could come to Israel right now. I could move to the occupied territories. I could claim citizenship overnight. My friend who's Palestinian in Vancouver, Hannah, he can barely even visit. He was born here. I was born in Budapest, Hungary. But not only would I be granted citizenship, if I moved into the settlements, I'd be immediately granted 6 times as much water annually as a Palestinian resident of the occupied territories. That's how they divide or a portion of water rights. I mean, and then the incredible hypocrisy of the Western media. Incredible. They don't report this stuff. Nobody in the West knows this stuff. Every once in a while, when Israel goes a bit overboard and kills too many Arab children, you might read an article about it in the Western press. My gosh, with the Ukraine war, we hear about it all the time, as we should. But when it happens here, it's like it doesn't exist. Imagine if the Russians arrested a 15-year-old Ukrainian girl. You wouldn't read about it on the front page of the New York Times? Happens in Jerusalem all the time. So that's what's going on here.